October 14, 1943, a British military intelligence processing facility on the western edge of Cairo, Egypt, housed in a requisitioned Ottoman-era administrative building, whose thick stone walls hold the desert heat long after the sun goes down and whose corridors smell of cigarette smoke and carbon paper, and the particular institutional staleness of a building doing serious work inside a shell built for something else entirely. Outside, the city carries on with the layered noise of a place that has been simultaneously a wartime capital, a military logistics hub, and a civilian metropolis for 3 years. Traffic and vendors and the call to prayer from the mosque 2 streets west and the sound of British military vehicles on the Corniche. Inside, in a room on the 2nd floor with a single window covered by a wooden shutter and a ceiling fan that moves the heat without reducing it, a table has been set with 2 chairs facing each other, and a lamp angled so that its light falls toward the chair on the right rather than the one on the left. A British military intelligence corporal is sitting in the chair on the left, which is the darker of the 2. She has been in this room since 7 this morning. It is now 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. She has conducted 4 interrogations today and is preparing for the 5th. The 5th prisoner is a German Luftwaffe Hauptmann named Werner Steinhoff, who was captured 6 days ago when his aircraft was forced down over the desert west of Mersa Matruh, and who has, in 6 days of standard processing, said his name, his rank, his service number, and nothing further, which is his right under the Geneva Convention, and which he has exercised with the composed certainty of a man who believes that nothing being attempted in this building will change that. He does not yet know who is sitting in the chair on the left. He has been told he is being taken to a standard processing session. The word standard, in this context, is doing a considerable amount of work. Corporal Miriam Hacohen was 24 years old. She was born in Frankfurt am Main in 1919, the only daughter of a civil engineer named Avraham Hacohen, who had built a moderate and respectable practice in the Sachsenhausen district of the city, over 20 years of careful work, and who had read the direction of German politics with sufficient clarity and sufficient speed to move his family to Mandatory Palestine in the summer of 1933, when Miriam was 13 years old and the laws had not yet been written. But the writing was already visible in everything that was happening around them. The family settled in Haifa, in a neighborhood of recent German Jewish immigrants who carried Central European professional culture with them into the Mediterranean heat, and who conducted their community life in German before Hebrew, and whose children learned Hebrew in the street and German at home and Arabic from the neighbors and English from the British administration that governed the territory they had arrived in. Miriam absorbed all 4 languages with the specific ease of an adolescent in a multilingual environment where the choice of which language to speak in a given moment was itself a social and political act that required reading the room, reading the person, and understanding that the same information delivered in different languages produced different responses in the people receiving it. She understood this not as a theory but as a daily operational reality by the time she was 16. She completed her schooling at the WWII school in Haifa, studied 1 year of economics at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and in the years before the war's outbreak was involved, in a capacity she did not fully disclose to her parents, in the intelligence information work of the Ghana, the Jewish paramilitary organization operating in Mandatory Palestine, which had been systematically developing its own network of field intelligence specialists since the Arab Revolt of 1936, had demonstrated that knowing what the other side was planning before it happened was the difference between a community that survived and one that did not. She had been running information between Haifa and Jerusalem for 2 years before the British Army's recruitment drive for the Auxiliary Territorial Service reached the Jewish community of Mandatory Palestine in 1941, and she volunteered in March 1942 not because she had no reservations about the British, whose immigration restrictions on Jewish refugees from Europe she understood precisely and bitterly, but because the war against Germany was a war she had a specific, personal, entirely non-abstract interest in winning, and because the British military had something that the Haganah in its current state did not have: formal intelligence training, institutional resources, and a direct line to the German prisoners being retaken in enormous numbers across the Western Desert Campaign. She had been assigned to the Cairo Intelligence Processing Facility after 4 months of training in signals and interrogation methodology at a British facility in Egypt, during which her evaluating officer had written in her assessment file that she possessed a combination of linguistic precision and interpersonal control that he had encountered in very few people of either sex in his experience of intelligence work. She had read this assessment over the evaluating officer's shoulder when he left the file on his desk during a session break and had not mentioned to him that she had read it, because the ability to read something without indicating that you have read it is among the more fundamental skills of the specific work she had been trained to do. Hauptmann Werner Steinhoff was 38 years old, a career Luftwaffe officer from Dresden who had been flying since 1935 and who had served across the North Africa campaign with the distinction of a man who was technically skilled, operationally experienced, and entirely confident in his own capacity to manage whatever the war produced in the way of inconvenience. He was not a particularly ideological man. His allegiance was to the Luftwaffe as an institution, to the professional culture of German aviation, and to the specifically German conception of officer behavior that included a high tolerance for physical discomfort and a somewhat lower tolerance for situations in which the proper order of things was being departed from. 6 days in Allied captivity had been managed with the same disciplined composure he would have brought to 6 days of bad flying weather. He had given his name, rank, and serial number at every session, and had found this to be an entirely workable approach. He had formed, in 6 days, a general assessment of the British military intelligence personnel who had processed him that was not entirely flattering, competent, he thought, within the limits of a professional culture that emphasized procedure over perception, and that had produced, in his experience thus far, a series of questions that were well organized and entirely predictable. He had been told he was being taken to a standard processing session. He had been through 4 standard processing sessions. He expected to manage the 5th with the same ease he had managed the others. He was escorted through the corridor and into the room on the 2nd floor and sat down in the chair on the right and looked across the table at the person sitting in the chair on the left in the shadow and made his initial assessment of what he was looking at. A young woman, he thought mid-20s, British uniform with corporal stripes, dark eyes, a notepad and a pencil on the table in front of her. He had not previously been interrogated by a woman and did not adjust his estimate of the session's difficulty accordingly. This was the first error. By the autumn of 1943, the recruitment of Jewish women from Mandatory Palestine into the British Auxiliary Territorial Service and Women's Auxiliary Air Force had produced several thousand servicewomen whose specific combination of languages, German and European languages acquired from families that had fled Central Europe, Arabic acquired from life in Mandatory Palestine, Hebrew as a first language, English from the British educational system, gave them a capacity for intelligence work that the British military had not systematically anticipated when the recruitment drives began, and that it was, in some parts of the intelligence apparatus and less so in others, beginning to use with increasing intentionality. The women who served in intelligence roles at facilities like the Cairo Processing Center Fermel occupied an unusual position in the institutional structure. Formerly part of the ATS, with the ATS's limited authority and the informal dismissiveness that British military culture of the period directed at women in uniform generally, but operationally deployed in intelligence functions whose requirements their specific backgrounds made them uniquely equipped to perform. Some of the German and Italian prisoners being processed had been told or had assumed that women in the room were translators rather than interrogating officers, an assumption that several of the ATS intelligence women had learned to use as a professional tool rather than address as a personal irritant, because a prisoner who is performing his composure for an audience he does not fully respect performs it less carefully than one who understands he is in a real interrogation, and careful performance is the one thing an interrogator most needs the prisoner to abandon. Miriam set her pencil on the notepad and looked at Steinhoff for a moment without speaking. Then she asked him, in German, whether he would like water before they began. Steinhoff received the German with a brief visible adjustment of something in his expression. Not alarm, but the specific recalibration of a man who has just received information that requires updating a previous assessment. He said, in German, that he would not, and that he wished to note for the record that he had already provided his name, rank, and serial number to 3 previous processing sessions, and that he did not intend to provide additional information regardless of how the session was structured. Miriam said she understood and asked him how long he had been stationed at Fliegerführer Africa before his capture. Steinhoff said he was not going to answer that. Miriam said of course and made a note on her pad and asked him whether the aircraft lost in his group between August and September had been primarily mechanical failures or combat losses. Steinhoff said he was not going to answer that either. Miriam said she understood and made another note and told him she was going to describe to him what she already knew about the operational disposition of his group from the documentation recovered when his aircraft went down and from the cumulative intelligence record her unit maintained on Luftwaffe formations in the theater, and that she wanted him to listen carefully because she was going to ask him one question at the end, and it would be a specific question, and the answer to it was the only piece of information she did not already have. She said this in the same conversational German she had been speaking throughout, the Frankfurt German of her childhood, and she watched his face carefully as she heard it register on him. The specific accent, the city behind it, the implication that the person across the table from him had grown up in a German city in the same years he was completing his officer training. She spoke for 12 minutes. She described the group's losses, its current operational strength, its probable basing location, its coordination with Italian units, and the likely assignment of its remaining aircraft after the losses of August and September. She described all of this from what was genuinely a combination of the documentary recovery from his aircraft and the cumulative intelligence picture, and she described it in German with the operational precision of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how to use accurate information as a demonstration of capacity, rather than simply as a collection of facts. When she finished, she looked at him and asked the single question she had told him she was going to ask. It concerned the location of a specific forward refueling position that his group had been using in the Western Desert that the Allied air campaign had been unable to identify from aerial reconnaissance. She asked it in a single clean sentence and set her pencil to the notepad and waited. Steinhoff answered after approximately 20 seconds of silence. He answered in German, in the operational specificity of a man who had decided, for reasons that he did not articulate, and that Miriam did not ask him to articulate, that the question he was being asked had been earned by the person asking it in a way that his previous refusals no longer comfortably applied to. He answered accurately. Miriam wrote down what he said in her small, precise handwriting, thanked him in German, and told the guard at the door that the session was concluded. She completed the intelligence report that evening and submitted it through the standard channel to the section's supervising officer. The report identified the refueling location with sufficient precision that a subsequent RAF operation was able to act on it within 8 days. She did not document in the report the specific exchange at the end of the session that had produced Steinhoff's answer, because the methodology she had used was not one she had been formally trained in, and because she understood that the thing that had made it work was not a procedure but a combination of personal history, linguistic precision, and the specific decision she had made at 13 years old to leave Frankfurt rather than stay, which was the kind of thing that does not translate well into the standard intelligence report format. Miriam Hacohen was discharged from the British Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945, one of approximately 4,000 Jewish women from Mandatory Palestine, who had served in the British military during the war, a number that represented the largest per capita female military service contribution of any single community in the Allied forces, and that was not publicly acknowledged in any formal recognition until decades after the fact, because the British military's relationship with the Jewish community of Mandatory Palestine in the post-war years was structured by the political crisis over Jewish immigration and independence in ways that made formal recognition of Jewish military contribution politically inconvenient. She returned to Haifa in September 1945 and joined the Haganah's intelligence branch with the specific training and operational experience of a British-trained interrogations specialist, which made her, in the years between 1945 and 1948, among the more formally qualified intelligence personnel available to an organization that was preparing to fight a war it had no formal military infrastructure to support yet. She served in the intelligence section of the Israel Defense Forces during the 1948 War of Independence and left military service in 1950 to work as a secondary school teacher in Haifa, teaching German and English to students who found her insistence on precision exhausting and whose own children would later describe her as the best teacher they ever had. She died in 2001 at the age of 81, having given one documented interview about her ATS service in 1992 to a researcher at the Hebrew University compiling oral histories of Jewish women who had served in the British military during the Second World War. In that interview, she was asked what had been the most useful thing her military training had given her. She said the training had given her organization and methodology, and that both of these were valuable, but that the most useful thing she had brought into the intelligence work was something she had learned in Haifa at 13 years old, which was that the same information delivered in the right language to the right person at the moment when they were no longer performing for an audience they had fully assessed produced a quality of response that no formal procedure was designed to generate and that no formal procedure could teach. Werner Steinhoff was processed through the standard prisoner of war system and held at a facility in Egypt for the remainder of the war. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. The IFF report from his October 1943 interrogation noted his name, rank, and the information he had provided, but did not name the interrogating officer by anything other than rank designation in the document's attribution line. The refueling position he identified was struck by the RAF 8 days after the session. Steinhoff worked as a commercial aviation administrator in post-war West Germany for 22 years. He died in 1981. No record survives of whether he retained any particular memory of the session in Cairo or of the corporal sitting in the darker chair. Some historians who have studied the service of Jewish women from Mandatory Palestine in the British military have argued that this population's specific contribution to Allied intelligence operations across the North Africa and Mediterranean theaters was systematically under-recorded for two reasons. First, because women in the ATS occupied an administrative position that frequently obscured the operational significance of their actual work in the documentation, and second, because the post-war political rupture between Britain and the Jewish community over Palestine made comprehensive recognition of Jewish military contribution to the Allied effort politically complicated for both sides in different ways. They argue that the intelligence work performed by Hebrew and German-speaking ATS women in Cairo and elsewhere produced results that shaped tactical and operational decisions in ways that the existing record cannot fully quantify, because the record was constructed by a documentation system that was not designed to capture what these particular people were doing or how they were doing it. Others have pointed to the trajectory of women like Hacohen, from ATS intelligence training directly into the intelligence infrastructure of the nascent Israeli military, as evidence that the British military's unintended contribution to the establishment of the Israeli state included providing formal intelligence training to several hundred young women who brought that training directly into the organizations that would fight the 1948 war, making the ATS recruitment of Jewish women from Palestine one of the more consequential unintended policy outcomes of the British military administration in the Middle East during the Second World War. What is certain is that approximately 4,000 women from the Jewish community of Mandatory Palestine chose to serve in the British military during a war that threatened to exterminate their people while the British government restricted Jewish immigration to the territory they lived in, and that they made this choice in full knowledge of the contradiction and that they served in it with a quality of purpose that had very specific roots in who they were and where they had come from and what they had been carrying before any uniform was issued to them. If you had been Miriam Hacohen sitting in the darker chair when Steinhoff walked through the door, what would you have said first? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe the 4,000 women whose names are not in the histories that everyone reads deserve to be in the record alongside the men, subscribe, because we are only beginning to read what they left behind.